Good morning. What I've been playing for you are some compositions from our psalm today. The last one is by Robert Reich, the modern classical composer. The one before that was by Nava Tehillah, which is a popular synagogue group in Israel. In that, what will be our key focus this morning in Psalm 16 is verse 8. In that, verse 8 reads as follows: Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid ki mimini bal emot. I place Adonai before me always, at my right hand, that I may not stumble. That line, verse 8, the first word is Shiviti, I will place or I set, is the name given to artworks. Here's an artwork from my library. Now, I was a little disappointed when I took this off my wall and looked at it carefully because I didn't find the word Shiviti in it. These Jewish mandalas are called Shiviti because the focus of a Shiviti is God's name, Yud He Vav He. You can see here prominently God's name, Yud He Vav He. So that what these Jewish artworks starting in the 18th century had in common is the focus on God's name as a focal point to aid spiritual concentration, to aid prayer, and also as an amulet, as a folk protection for a home. So at the end of our 20 minutes of analyzing the psalm, I'm gonna, this time, instead of our normal conversation, have 10 minutes of sharing some Shivitis and a little bit about the history of these Jewish artworks that again are called Shivitis, the first word of verse 8, regardless if they contain that word. But what they all have is the second word, Shiviti Adonai. I have placed Yud He Vav He, God's name, or God, always before me. So in analyzing our psalm this morning, and again, I delight in having, by the way, the number 26 so far is special. That's Yud He Vav He. If you take those letters, that equals 26. Which is the number of screens we have at the moment. That's an aside. So what my goal is in terms of going through this 11-verse psalm is to give added context to what will become this not only inspiration for mandalas, but verse 8 is also, if you will, a mantra. So Jewish meditation teachers who often will take a psalm or a verse of psalm for purposes of repetition to create that clarity of clearing of mind. This verse 8 is one of the more popular of those Jewish mantras. But in reading the psalm, you will see, as is true for all psalms, and one little foreshadowing for tomorrow, verse 17 can be understood in contradictory ways in terms of what is the nature of the psalmist. So even here we'll see that there's a lot of room for differences in terms of understanding our psalmist. With that, let me read the psalm, then I'll point out some of the structural weave, and then we'll look more carefully at verse 8. Psalm 16. Reads as follows. Michtam of David, guard me, El, for I shelter in you. I said to Adonai, my master you are, for I have no good without you. As for the holy that are in the land and the mighty, whom are all my desire, let their sufferings multiply, they who rushed after another. I will not pour their drink offerings of blood, nor bear their names upon my lips. Adonai is my allotted portion and my cup. You sustain my fate. An inheritance fell to me pleasantly. Indeed, my heritage is beautiful to me. I will bless Adonai, who counsels me even in the nights when my conscience chastised me. I place Adonai before me always, at my right hand, that I may not stumble. Therefore, my heart is happy and my glorious soul rejoices. Even my flesh abides securely. For you will never abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your devoted one to see Shachat. You make known to me the paths of life, overflowing with joy before your presence. Delights are in your right hand, enduringly. As I read it out loud in this moment, what I am feeling is this quality of joy that the psalm ends with. And in that regard, you can see with verse 8 that by placing the Lord always before one, there's the promise of a life lived in joy. At the same time, where the rabbis will differ in how they understand this psalm, let me first point out to you poetically its structure. Verse 1 is a request. We don't know what the word michtam is. Some say it's a musical composition. Others say it's an instrument. Others say it means with purity or like gold. Martin Cohen calls it a psalm of gold of David. Guard me, El. Now, El is used occasionally. It's a generic name for God. It's also what the Canaanites called God, El, in the same time as the Israelites. So guard me, El, for I shelter in you. Opening with the word El creates a certain tension. Who is the God that the psalmist yearns for protection? Who is this El? And then it immediately shifts to, I said to Adonai. Structurally, verses 2 and 4, 2 to 4 are often understood as a unit, describing the rejection of others who are disloyal to God. Verses 5 to 8, the next verses, next 4, are thanksgiving for God as his portion. And then 9 to 11 are rejoicing. So there's a movement. There's a sense of, God, you saw how loyal I am. And that's verses 2 to 4. I'm grateful for what you have given me, and having you before me gives me joy. That seems to be the arc. And yet, let me share some of the ambiguity. Verse 3, I translate, as for the holy that are in the land and the mighty, whom are all my desire. Now, who are the holy that were in the land and the mighty that he, the Psalter, sought? It can be linked to verse 4. Let their sufferings multiply, they who rushed after another implying another God. I will not pour their drink offerings of blood, nor beat their names upon my lips. So what is prompting the Psalter in this second piece, verses 2 to 4? It can be a rejection of the pagans around who are mighty in the land of Israel. It can be that, this is Rabbi Martin Cohen's commentary, it's a psalm written by the Levites protesting the priests. They who hold themselves out to be holy, who pour the blood, not the blood, the wine libations, they are corrupt, so it's as if blood. So Martin Cohen sees this as a protest psalm by the Levites against the Kohanim. Remarkably, with verse 3, classic commentaries like Rashi see verse 3 as not about the other, but about Abraham. So the Psalter is saying here how differently verse 3 can be understood. Likdoshim, for the holy, namely for Abraham, that are in the land, that are buried in the land, and the mighty, his descendants, whom were all my desire. They were the ones who have inspired me, my ancestors who have given me merit. Not those others who worship foreign gods. That's verse 4. So again, verse 3 is a central verse that can be understood in opposite ways. Is verse 3 a protest to the people in power in his day that then sets up the flow of what will come? Or is it a statement of loyalty grounded, wordplay intended, in the ancestors and one's past? And I just pause with that because I spent this morning continuing to prepare for tomorrow, Psalm 17. And again, I'm reminded as to the nature of poetry that you can have opposite understandings of the same words, literally opposite. You know, is it the enemy or is it the ancestors? And at the same time, both can simultaneously be true. It's precisely that tension that's part of the nature of poetry itself. And in that regard, look at verse 10 for another tension. For you will never abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your devoted one to see Shachat. Now, we talked in a previous session about, one second. We talked in a previous session about the world to come, and there is a sense in Psalms of seeing death as going into the grave. And what is Sheol, the netherworld, is an unknown rather than a longing. That seems to be the implication here. Do not abandon my soul to Sheol. Do not allow your devoted one to see Shachat. Shachat is a synonym for Sheol, though in the Talmud it will describe it as a lower level. If you will, there are gradations of suffering in the other world also, Shachat being a lower level. So you're going from Sheol to Shachat. And at the same time, other commentators in the classic mode will say, no, this is a prayer about the afterlife. You will not abandon my soul, meaning I trust that when I die, you will be with your devoted one. That 10 can be seen as a statement pointing to the future of faith in God being present in the afterlife. So two key verses, verse 10 and verse 3, are remarkably subject to interpretation. And yet, verse 11, you know, the last verse of Psalms as often feels like a tag on. In this case, It ends in joy. Todi'eni orach hayim. You make known to me the path of life. And as I've shared to you grammatically, that can also be adjussive. You know, may you make known to me the path of life. You can either overflowing with joy before your presence. And again, in parentheses, presence now or presence in the world to come, meaning is 11, how do you read 10 informs how you read 11. Overflowing with joy before your presence, delights are in your right hand enduringly. Some things to note is that in this psalm, there is a waffling back and forth between addressing God in the second person as you, which occurs 5 times, and as the third person, Yud He Vav He or El, which occurs 5 times. 4 times Yud He Vav He, 1 time El, which is the nature of a relationship of God, as we see when you say even a blessing, Baruch Atah Adonai, right? Praised are you, second person, and then we immediately go to the third person, Yud He Vav He. That tension of how do you draw close to God? You draw close, and then you kind of pull back in terms of respect. God's up here, Yud He Vav He, is present in this psalm with that equal number of second person and third person in addressing God. Here's one other thing that I just think is worth pointing out, and that is there's a lot of use of body parts in this psalm. And in verse 9, it can either be my glory rejoices or my liver rejoices. Now, liver is the body part that's identified with thought and conscience. So it can be my heart is happy, my conscience rejoices. So you can do it either. Kvodi in Hebrew is also an expression of God's presence within us, the glory that we hold. And so poetically, there are these opportunities to read it both ways. With that, we're already at 10:20. So let me teach a little bit about Shiviti. I find it fascinating and yet understandable that in a religion that emphasizes God as having no body, God is not being physical, and even in the 10 Commandments, right? You shall not make any graven images after my likeness. And that to some degree, even today, certain Orthodox people will not have art that has figures in it. Nonetheless, beginning in the 18th century, which is relatively late in terms of a 2,000-year-old, 3,000, these psalms can be as old as 3,000 years old, if you go back to counting them from the time of David. So relatively short time, the last 200 years or so, there has been a flowering of Jewish art that's called Shiviti. That first word in verse 8. And in Encyclopedia Judaica, as one example, there are many examples of Shiviti. So I have Eric's going to put up some of those. And I'm going to just talk a little, like here, the top one that you're looking at will have, see on top here is Shiviti, Adonai lenegdi tamid. It's the first half, by the way, of that expression. Shiviti, I have always placed Yud He Vav He opposite me. Here, a little comment on Shiviti, because it's too satisfying, and I don't want in this rush of time to overlook with what does Shiviti mean. The Baal Shem Tov, the great initiator of folk mysticism, of Chassidut, 1700 to 1760, which I think is part of the reason for the flowering of Shiviti. He said, what does Shiviti mean? It means equal. How's that? Shaveh, Hebrew for equal. He says it means equanimity. When one accepts good and accepts bad as God's will, and therefore has a state of equanimity, that is when God is before one. So it's the reward, or it's simultaneously the aspiration that we should be of equanimity. Samson Raphael Hirsch will take that first word, Shiviti, and he'll say it's shaveh, same word, to level, but it means to level so there are no obstructions, to level the field. So when you look, you can see clearly. And that's, may it be Shiviti. May it all be level so that Yud He Vav He is always before me. May I have the experience. And then the second part of the verse, Ki mimini balamot, at my right hand that I may not stumble. And Rambam, the great Jewish philosopher, will comment that just like your right hand is your strength, if you're a right-handed person, and is ever part of your body, so God is your strength and is always with you. And that's the second half of that phrase. So back to the image. The image of Shiviti almost always has a menorah. That's the 7-branched lamp that was contained in the Mikdash and later in the temple. The temple, or the Mikdash, is a symbol of being close to God. And so that's the yearning. The yearning is, may we have that quality of experience of God, if you will, just like the priest did in the holy space of the tabernacle. May I draw close to God in that same way. And I will add that with the destruction of the temple, there's a greater emphasis on every Jew potentially being a priest. In the reciting of the Amidah prayer, that's when 3 times a day an offering would be brought. Every time a Jew prays the Amidah, it's like bringing an offering as if you were a priest on behalf of the community. And so the menorah is a vital part of all the Shivitis. The 2 Shivitis that you have, the one on top is from North Africa in the 18th century, Morocco, which by the way is where the Khamsa also initiated, and Khamsa was used as an amulet, and this too was also used as an amulet. Underneath it from Morocco, 19th century. Put up another one, please, Eric. Now, here, what Eric has put up are from the 19th century of Eastern Europe. This one on top has a lot of Talmudic passages related to the patriarchs. And on the bottom, this one is not on paper, it's on metal. And that would have been put in front of the reader's stand when the person leading the prayers prayed. And I have seen it so commonly in Orthodox synagogues in Israel. In most Orthodox synagogues I have been to in Israel, in front of the prayer's position is such a Shiviti that it very quickly became widespread, meaning it only began in the 18th century. By the 19th century, that's when it really flowered in Eastern Europe and around the Jewish world as a focal point to inspire prayer. All right, another one, Eric. So here you can see how colorful they are. The one on the bottom is a paper cut, which is a popular form of Jewish folk art. That's Galicia, Poland, in, again, the 19th century, not so far from where the Baal Shem Tov taught and preached. And above it is from Iran, also of the 19th century. It contains the names of Adam and Eve, the patriarchs and matriarchs, sages buried in Eretz Yisrael. So you can see on these how they become much more elaborate in terms of color as art, but no human figures as such. In that regard, this is Jewish folk art, Shiviti, from our reading. And one last one that I have from Encyclopedia Judaica, Eric. Did I send you any more? Or is that what I sent you? I guess that's what I sent you. So in that regard, let me pull that together. Rashi, the classic biblical commentator, says regarding verse 8, I place Adonai before me always, at my right hand, that I may not stumble. And that is, who is the one that I may not stumble? It can be understood one other way. I place Adonai before me always at my right hand, that never stumbles. For Rashi, it's God who never stumbles. So God remains firm. When I have God at my right hand, I'm secure too. Again, that just to emphasize how these can be understood so differently, and also humility. Look, I may stumble, but God never stumbles. And so there's this quality in reading these Psalms of the lens of piety through which one reads it. In the Talmud, already in Sanhedrin 22a, Rabbi Chana ben Bizra said in the name of Rabbi Shimon the Pious, when a person prays, they should regard themselves as though the Shekhinah, God's feminine presence, the accessible presence, were before him or her, as it is written, Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid. I have said Adonai before me always. So those words, going to the early centuries of the Common Era, the early rabbis, elevated that line of this psalm to be central to prayer. And it took, again, many hundreds of years before that image got translated into art, and in the interim remained an essential mindset of prayer. Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid, may I place Yud He Vav He opposite me always, and then the reward at my right hand, that I may not stumble. That takes us up to 10:30, which is when we would stop. And I am pretty diligent in terms of stopping on time so that people can allocate only a half hour. At the same time, for those who would wish to spend 10 more minutes, because there was no time for debriefing, and I always gain so much from your comments, no, for those who would wish to spend another 10 minutes, it's overtime to answer questions or to react to this artfully written psalm. Go right ahead if you'd like to react or ask a question.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Hi, it's Jerry.
Hi, Jerry.
I don't know why, but I became obsessed while we were studying this particular psalm with Chatati lenegdi tamid, which is what David says about his sin with Bathsheba and the whole thing. And he says, for the rest of my life, lenegdi tamid, chatati. And I wonder whether that's a sort of a counter. I don't know. No idea.
That's a wonderful question, and it reveals both your learning And interestingly, as I prepared the psalm, I did not see that parallel presented. And I think it's fascinating, the image, and creates this tension of David saying, I'm always going to keep my sin before me. Here, I'm always going to keep Yud Hey Vav Hey before me.
Right.
And
Anyway.
what I value is tension. And that is by virtue of being the identical words, an expression of the tension embedded in the Psalms in terms of what is a religious mindset. That's a great question, Jerry. And I'm going to hold on to it.
Me. Thank you for affirming me, Rabbi.
Yeah, and I'll go back to it once we get to that other psalm.
Okay.
Other questions or comments? Robin, Rabbi Thunberg?
Hi, Rabbi, and hi, everybody. So I think it's a blessing to me that the other meeting that I had scheduled at this time got canceled because Psalm 16 is my favorite psalm. It especially spoke to me when I was in rabbinic school. You know, that when you're in rabbinic school, there's this longing for connection and that idea that we really want to understand and feel God's presence all the time. And I had the pleasure of taking a prayer class with Debbie Friedman of blessed memory, the great Jewish songwriter. And she charged us, especially the cantorial students, but if the rabbis did it, we got extra credit, to write a song about anything that we wanted. And I actually wrote a song about this, including the words to this psalm. Shema Koli, I wanted God to hear my voice and know that I was there and know that I was keeping God in front of me and this yearning that I had. And Debbie was so gracious because this rabbinic student who's not a songwriter offered this blessing, this prayer. And then as a surprise to me, one of my cantorial student friends stood up to give a presentation about what I thought was going to be his own song. And it turned out he had put music to my words. And it was just so touching in that moment. It makes me cry to this day because I really do feel in those kinds of moments that God is with me, that God, through my friends, through my colleagues, through my students, through my teachers, is letting me know that God hears me and is connected to me. So I just think this prayer is just so beautiful. And the idea of Shiviti, I don't have a Shiviti in my house that says Shiviti, but I do have a wall of Hamsas, and I look at them all the time. And it is just a reminder, that constant reminder of who I am. I'm a Jewish person and I have a relationship with God. So I'm so glad I got to sit in on this session today. Thank you.
You're welcome. And thanks for sharing that story, Robin. A few associations that come with you talking about this as your favorite psalm. Do know that Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who was the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov and a great teacher, he listed 10 psalms that he saw as cleansing psalms, what he called tikkun klali, and Psalm 16 is the first of them. I can rattle them off. I wrote it down. 16, 32, 41, 42, 59, 77, 90, 105, and 137. But for him, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, this too is a particularly powerful psalm of connection, of cleansing. And you can see the two verses that lead into verse 8. An inheritance fell to me pleasantly. Indeed, my heritage is beautiful to me. I will bless Adonai who counsels me, even in the nights when my conscience chastised me. There's a quality of faithfulness, of seeing God's gifts of heritage as beautiful, that gives the context for I place Adonai before me always, at my right hand, that I may not stumble. And then again, I love that closing verse 11. You make known to me the path of life, overflowing with joy before your presence. Delights are in your right hand enduringly. So there is a sense of there are those who are unholy, going after other gods, but not you. You are the real deal that allows me to feel secure and joyful. A closing, an additional comment or question?
Thank you, Rabbi. Such
You're
a good
welcome. So let me
class.
add some closing comments then. I entitled this Shiviti, Always Before Me. Benjamin Siegel, who's an important writer on Psalms, who I often use to prepare, entitled this psalm, The Totally Committed, which is how he experiences the psalmist in this case. In contrast, the Psalm 17 that follows, Benjamin Siegel, for instance, will read that psalm as a psalm even of hubris, of being overly confident. Others read it the opposite, much more even than this psalm. And I showed you how that one verse 3, could be understood in contradictory ways, either referring to ancestors that give us grace before God, or refer to the so-called holy, meaning the either corrupt priests or the pagans in our midst. So tomorrow, Psalm 17 can be read in very different ways, either pietistically or as a statement of a quality of confidence before God. So I look forward to sharing Psalm 17 with you. Do we have anybody today who needs to say Kaddish? So with nobody waving or stepping forward, I thank you for joining today. Have a good day. 5 o'clock this evening, I will be interviewing my son, John Spitz, who's an emergency room doctor at Mount Sinai in New York. You can find the Zoom link on our website. Thank you for enabling me to start my day in Psalms with you. Be well.